Okay, my name is John Denton. Welcome. I'm the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. The International Chamber of Commerce is this year celebrating its 100th year. We're a purpose-led institution. Our sole purpose in life is actually to enable business worldwide to secure peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. We're born out of the ashes of First World War, when business leaders came together with a common view that if business was able to work together across borders and allow goods to cross borders, there'd be no need for troops to enable that to happen. So, in a way, our past is very relevant to the present as well. So, for 100 years, we've sought to create an environment where it's been possible for business to do that. Importantly, when we celebrated our centennial this year in Paris, rather than looking backwards, we decided that the best thing we could do was to look forward. And what we sought to do in looking forward was to set out where we believed that ICC, as a purpose-led institution in the 21st century, could actually help shape the contours of the world to enable business to meet that historic mission of enabling peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. And we chose a number of areas. We're very actively engaged with the discussion on open markets, on maintaining and developing the multilateral system. We shifted our focus to actually really get involved in issues to do with preservation of the planet, because we wanted to make certain we could continue to trade. We also recognised that one of the growing issues, and one of the panels earlier today was actually around this issue of the growing rise in inequality, and we needed to grapple with that, and we've actually doubled down in our support of the Sustainable Development Goals. We also saw the shift to the digital economy and the need to actually ensure that that was better managed. But importantly, we actually saw an argument which was emerging around the nature and the shape of market-based capitalism in the 21st century. In the end, we are the institutional voice of 45 million businesses which are generally in that 45 million corporations, so companies. And those 45 million are not just in the Northern Hemisphere, in the North and the South. In fact, yesterday I just announced the opening of the ICC in Vietnam, where the Vietnamese business community has come together and said they want to engage with the sort of principles that we actually stand for, which is around this historic mission I mentioned before. The reason we decided to get involved in this discussion around the future of market-based capitalism, because we thought it was fundamental to the operation and the enabling of business. And let's face it, market-based capitalism is under siege because there is an emerging view that it no longer serves the common good. There is a sense of fundamental misalignment between the pursuit of individual benefit, which we can call profit, and the broader interests of the community, which we can call value. So a misalignment between benefit and value, and how do we understand value in the 21st century. So if we want to preserve market-based capitalism, we actually have to do something about ensuring that it transforms itself. So I'm not here today to bury the corporation. I'm actually here today to help find a way to ensure that it can live on. But there is some work that needs to be done in terms of this issue of alignment. By the way, this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, you can look historically at this. There's been moments when there's been a misalignment between benefit and value before. The reality is that in order to do something about it, in some cases there's been revolution, in other cases there's been a gradual transformation. You actually have to identify the problem of misalignment, and you have to work to actually reform the institutions that underpin it. And for us in this case, it's actually the corporation. It's one that needs to be worked on. And we do that to ensure that we can align the corporation with value, with the value that's expected of communities. Now, change or transformation that we're talking about will only happen when a significant or critical mass of people see a challenge, or see this as a challenge or opportunity, and mobilise to do something about it. Now, as I said, we are the institutional voice of 45 million businesses. We identified this in our declaration as an issue, an opportunity, a challenge, and we are prepared to mobilise to do something about that. But we're not mobilising in a vacuum. We genuinely believe that in terms of what the community expects in terms of the value to be created, is very well articulated and agreed upon in the essence of the Sustainable Development Goals and in the essence of the actual coalition or coalescence of people around action on the planet through Paris and practical action as well to save the environment and actually work on climate. So we actually think that is there. So we have the capacity to identify the problem, we've got the capacity to mobilise people, and we're doing it within the context of what we think will actually present value for community. And so we want to engage in this discussion around how do we ensure market-based capitalism is fit for purpose for the 21st century, because from the ICC's point of view, this is a critical debate to be in and to participate in and to lead. We are not observers, and nor are we looking to come up with some kind of compromise statement on this. So one reason we're delighted to be here with the Athens Democracy Forum is that you're prepared to have a discussion about this. And obviously we're encouraged to come here by our Greek friends, Nikos Vernikos, who's here, who has been so heavily involved with the ICC, and we've actually come here because we see this is a new dialogue for us to enter into, and we should be here, and it could help us shape the view that ultimately will emerge during the course of the next year, as we've already commenced this process of trying to get alignment back, if I can put it that way. What I'll do now is we've got Pavan Sukhdev, who's the chair of World Wildlife Federation International, but also a private sector player, and also a thinker about these sorts of issues. Pavan has written a very important book on the Corporation 2020, and so I'm going to invite him to make some comments. And then Liz is going to actually moderate a discussion which will involve Maria Fernandez from the ICC and my chairman, who's actually is working very hard today, because this is, I think, his second panel, Paul Polman, and then we'll engage in a discussion and hopefully Q&A relatively early on, and then the New York Times will close. So we thank you for that. So hopefully, Pavan, the technology is working, and I can hand it over to you.
I think so, and welcome everyone, and thank you, John, and thank you, Paul, for inviting me to this gathering, and delighted to be here with you. So, what I'd like to do over the next 15 minutes is to give you a kind of historical as well as a business journey through the corporation and its purpose and where we are today and where we might, with the help of ICC and yourselves, be able to take the corporation and its compact, if you want to call it that, with society over the next few decades. Sometimes when I ask people who are new to this, not people like yourselves, then what do they think is the older institution in society? Is it the nation or is it the corporation? They instantly say nation. But of course, they are wrong. They are wrong by a few thousand years. Corporations have existed since 800 BC, the Strani in India, 400 BC, the Publicani in Rome, whereas a nation is actually a relatively recent phenomenon, which entails a contract between the citizen and the state, including voting rights, taxation, and so on and so forth. But really, the history of the corporation became quite exciting in the last century, in the 1820s to the 1850s, when we had the idea that a corporation can be an independent entity from its owners, that it is actually an artificial being, as they called it. And then finally that the capital that was invested by the owners was the total amount of their liability, and that there was a concept called limited liability, which came in the Netherlands, in the US, the Netherlands, and the UK around the same period. So these were amazing innovations at that time. And they led to what we see today, which is the corporation. But the real explosion in the number of corporations took place in the 1870s to the 90s, which was when the states of Jersey and Delaware in the US decided that they would unlimit the corporation, not as an artificial being which had a stated purpose, as in it's a company of men who are going to build a railroad, and not a stated location, as in between Manchester and London, and not for a certain period, which is only for 30 years. So the idea of limiting the purpose, the duration, and the location of the corporation, which was very much part of the original idea of the corporation, was basically taken away by the states of Jersey and Delaware in the US. And during that period in the 19th century, the number of companies in the US went up from just a few thousand to several hundred thousand, almost 1 million of them. So that was the explosion that took place. And then given that the corporation, which began even earlier in the UK to support and the limited liability idea, began to support the idea of small investors with small investments. How do you protect the small investor? The halfpenny stocks, as they used to call them in the old days. How do you protect the investor in the halfpenny stock to not lose any more than the halfpenny that he and his family in the mining world of Birmingham and Manchester were able to support and provide? But that initial idea was just part of a distant history, and then finally the corporation was actually the engine of the economy. Today, that's where we are. To the irritation of people, I sometimes say that, the corporation is the single most important institution of our time. The reason I say that, it is 2/3 of the economy and jobs. In the US, it is actually 74 to 75% of GVA and jobs. So, no matter what intention we have, change in direction, green economy, circular economy, regenerative economy, whatever it is that we have as a global intention in society, we are not really going to achieve that unless we change the engine of the main engine of society and its direction and its course. It is basically the corporation that drives the economy and its impacts, which are essentially its impacts on the environment and on society. The final sort of element of the history of the corporation came with an interesting court case in 1919 in the Michigan Supreme Court, which was called Dodge versus Ford, in which the Dodge brothers, who were 10% shareholders in the Ford Motor Company, basically after requesting him to pay them dividends and arguing with him to pay them dividends, finally took him to court because Mr. Henry Ford had different ideas. He just wanted to redeploy every penny of profit he made in Ford Motor Company back into the company to make it have bigger factories which could produce the Model T cheaper and better, so that every employee of Ford could afford a Ford car. That was the basic purpose. And that led to a legal battle in 1919. And interestingly enough, the Dodge brothers won. They were minorities, 10%. They won on minority rights. But in the dicta, that is the language at the end of the court case, the judge basically said that Mr. Henry Ford should know better than to work against the interests of the shareholder. And it was that little dicta, this little few sentences at the end of the judgment that just became the stuff of legend. And then suddenly society began to think of the corporation's purpose as profit, as the interest of the shareholder. And Dodge versus Ford, in my opinion, wrongly began to be quoted as the backdrop to that. But the irony is that the purpose of the corporation has always been different. In the days of the Sreni in 800 BC, it was to collect taxes and to create roads and build roads. In Rome, likewise, to build their marvelous expansion of their empire. And later on, to generate values and to take technology forward and to meet the needs of people. The idea that the purpose of the corporation is only profit and only profit, for that we have to credit mainly Professor Milton Friedman and his philosophy, which is, I would say, a hypothesis. No laws that I have seen actually say that it is not possible for a corporation to have a purpose beyond profit. Neither have I seen a single memorandum or article of association that says so, nor is there evidence that by pursuing purpose beyond profit, you will lose money or stop making profits. In the absence of that, I think we have to say that time has come to reconsider what truly is the purpose of this single most important institution of our time. I would argue, and I know that many of you would argue likewise, that it is really to engineer change in society and to solve social problems. And the question then arises, so how do we engineer this change in the corporation itself, in the engine of the economy? And that takes us to what I know Paul has mentioned this many times, the kind of world we are in is one which has systemic problems. It's not just about climate change, it's not just about ecological insecurity on fresh water and soils, it's not just about large inequities, inequalities in society. Reality is that one connects with the other. If we look at the GDP of the poor, we will find that a lot of the GDP of the rural employment in countries like Sub-Saharan Africa, countries and India and Pakistan and so on, this is actually small-scale agriculture, and this is forest gathering. And there's hundreds of millions of people in that kind of employment. To them, the GDP, the single largest part of their GDP, is what comes from nature. So we do have a very complicated world, and we are not going to be able to solve these problems in a complicated world unless the engine that is driving the economy, whose impacts are pushing us towards planetary boundaries, is itself a different engine. So the question then becomes, okay, so if it is, we need a different kind of engine, and not yesterday's, what I call Corporation 1920, but something more like a new corporation, Corporation 2020, whose purpose is beyond profit. It's actually solving social problems. What do we need to do? What does society need to do? And I think this is an important question, because the reality is that a corporation, like any other species, responds and evolves in response to its environment. And the environment of the corporation is basically policies, prices, and institutions. So then we have to check, okay, what policies, which prices, and what institutions should we, as in society overall, try to change to ensure that we end up with the right kind of corporation, which generates profits for its owners, but also benefits for its stakeholders, as in its employees, its customers, the government, and other, and indeed collaborators and competitors. The book that John, you so kindly mentioned, is actually called Corporation 2020, in pursuit of this idea that not so much about Vision 2020, which is Alan White's initiative, but more about the timeline, because to me, the urgency of today's context, whether it's climate or freshwater or biodiversity loss, or indeed whether it is in the tearing of the social fabric that we are seeing happening sadly in so many countries around the world, that context is one of urgency, extreme urgency, I would say. And therefore, we need to make some changes very fast. And I convinced myself that there were basically four changes that needed to be made fast, and they were all coming from the outside in. They, of course, involved the corporation, but they were all in some way connected with a regulation. So in short order, the changes would have to be, we need to redesign taxation, which is basically the G20 finance ministries, to make it less onerous on generating profit and less onerous on generating tax on income. In other words, we tend to tax the goods. We tend to hard work is a good thing, income, and therefore income tax. Innovation and enterprise in a corporation is a good thing, we tax that, the corporation tax. What we don't do enough is tax the bads, which means extraction of minerals, including fossil fuels, extraction, the creation of pollution such as CO2, which cause damage to society. We don't really, with a few exceptions like Sweden on the sell side, we don't really have taxes on these things. So we tend to tax the goods more and tend to tax the bads less. Actually, we should reconfigure this the other way around. The second thing that we don't do terribly well is recognize the risks that leverage generates. Now, I'm not just speaking as an ex-banker, but certainly that helped me to understand this, that the last four recessions were driven by either abused leverage or misused leverage or excessive leverage or misapplied leverage. And we've got to learn our lessons from this. We need to control leverage. It cannot be just that you can go to the money markets, or if you can't get from the banks, issue commercial paper, issue debt, issue fixed equities, or use derivatives. But there has to be some sense of purpose. And I'm so glad that green bonds have arrived, because they force bankers, they force the world of finance to think about the purpose of finance, which is always tied, in the case of the green bond, to some change in the way that the value chain operates. The third issue that I thought was urgent was to do with advertising, because advertising fundamentally is being used today to create demand. So it is basically taking human insecurities and converting them into some form of wants, and wants into needs, needs into demand, demand into production, production to profits, and that's a cycle. And some of that is quite unethical when we look at how advertising is preying on, especially on the young and on children. And fourth, and perhaps this is where most progress has been made already, which is that we need to redefine performance. We need to look at how performance is measured for the corporation. If the only stakeholder of the corporation is the shareholder, then it's fine to measure purely profit and loss, because finally that is the accretion to the reserves, and that belongs to the shareholder. But if the purpose of the corporation is beyond profit, and we believe it is, then surely you need to look at the impacts of the corporation on human capital, that is the capital of its employees, their ability to earn and live a healthy and productive life. Surely it matters on social capital, which is the social fabric, the institutions, the trust in society without which nothing works. And surely we should measure the impact on natural capital, which is the environment, and ecological assets of the world. So we need to start measuring performance, not just as a change in financial capital belonging to shareholders, but in human, social, natural, and financial capital belonging to stakeholders and shareholders. And that's a different kind of profit and loss. It's called the integrated profit and loss. And indeed, some people have done this. I'll conclude my comments and give over to a Q&A for the next 5 minutes by saying this, that there is change happening, and I'm so pleased to be here at the ICC, especially because you are the heart of business. What you do over the next few years is going to absolutely and definitely change the direction of the corporation. I actually believe that what you are involved in, and I've heard both John and Paul speak on various occasions, is part of a great transition. Sorry, there's a echo happening right now. And I'll quote something called the Great Transition Initiative, which was started in 2010 by various people, including a friend of mine, Alan White, a person I deeply admire for his vision. With a bit of tongue-in-cheek, they took the title of a book that was written by David Corton called When Corporations Rule the World. And they are out to achieve what they call a new global corporate charter. So they call the new charter when they call the new charter When People Rule Corporations, and I think that's where we are today. So that's really what I wanted to comment on in terms of what needs to be done and the key areas of focus. I'm happy to take questions for the next 5 odd minutes. Thank you.
Thanks to both John and Pavan for those statements. Also, just quickly to introduce. Sorry. Okay. Oh, Pavan, if you put yours on mute, okay.
Yeah, we were on mute. I just opened it now to speak.
This is a business panel, not a technology panel, so by way of excuses. Anyway, thanks for both of those opening statements and welcoming up here, obviously, Paul Polman, the head of the ICC, and Fernanda Garza. One of the things that sort of most struck me actually about what Pavan just said was the idea that business needs to go beyond profit, and that one of the things that is in businesses' hands to control these days is measuring the performance of human and social capital instead of just profit. I want to speak to the both of you about that. Maria, I want to get to you in just a second, but Paul, earlier when we were on our panel earlier today regarding inequality, you got quite a bit of applause when you put forth the idea that indeed, companies have reached a point where, only shareholder value is not the sole kind of purpose for corporations anymore. But can you just talk to us a little bit about how widely accepted is that? And what is it that is really driving that? Inequality isn't necessarily good for companies either. So,
right.
How real is it?
So if I go one step back and get to your question, it's a little bit like white blood cells in our bodies. We need white blood cells to live, but we don't live for white blood cells. So companies need profits to survive, but their reason for being, if you want to be around long term, cannot be the sole pursuit of profits. So some people are now talking about profits with purpose. It's also not enough. You cannot just focus on your profits and say we'll do a little bit of purpose, because that's easily justifiable, and Michael Porter has made a whole business out of that called shared value, because you're happy, you use my product, or I employ a few people, you can quickly find some purpose. And I think a lot of businesses gravitate towards that and think that's enough, and that's what's called CSR. I think the real step that we now need to make is move from CSR, corporate social responsibility, to RSC. I deliberately used the same initials to save the business community money. But RSC is responsible social corporations, where you think about it and say, the pursuit of profit is because we are driving a business model with purpose. It's an outcome of what we do, not an objective. And that goes back to the heart of what business is invented. Business is invented here to serve society. If business cannot show that it has over time, and again, if you're around for the long term, a positive impact on society, why should society let you be around? I am first and foremost not a CEO of a company, I'm a citizen of planet Earth. So if businesses are not in sync with the planet, with its fellow citizens, and can show that they have a positive impact, then they have no reason to be around. And this is why you see businesses being voted out of office at 100 miles an hour right now. People really should take notice what is happening. We now have the means, the tools, the transparency to take action. People might say there is not many boycotts happening, but there certainly are a lot of boycotts happening, where the new generation that comes in, much more purpose-driven, is trying to figure out where do you put your money to reward the people that actually help make this a better world. And the cost of not doing this is tremendous for any business. The average engagement of people that come to work right now globally is only 13%. All of you, and sorry for my friends, piss away if it's 13%, 87% of employee engagement at work is lost, basically because the values of these individuals are not aligned with the values of a company. That's a tremendous cost. Trust in business is pretty low. 30% is now trust in business. Not different from governments, by the way, and frankly, may I say to the CEOs in the room, the trust for CEOs is even lower. That cost of trust or absence of trust is tremendous in your business, in your corporate reputation, in attracting talent, in getting engagement. So if you don't have a business model that is in sync with society, that is connected to solving these societal issues, that has a positive footprint, frankly, I don't think even personally you have any reason to be around.
And has it actually reached a point where businesses are losing money because consumers are voting
what
with
is
their
now happening is
pocketbooks?
if you go to the US about 3 decades ago, there were 8, and sorry again that I use you as numbers because that's really what is in the public domain. But in 3 decades ago in the US you had 8,000 publicly traded companies. You now have 4,200 publicly traded companies. It's actually one of the reasons why capital is not fairly spread anymore, is because we're starving the opportunity to participate. It's also the reason why Larry Fink from BlackRock now all of a sudden says we need purpose. I don't think he really understands fully what he's saying, but he sees his market disappearing.
Right.
So businesses now, and as I was mentioning on the panel, the average length of a publicly traded company lifetime is only 17 years now. The companies are disappearing. So if people want to be successful, want more longer term, it's not different from human beings, because ultimately a company is a reflection of a aggregation of humans who run that company. Companies have a heart, or they should have a heart. Companies have a life. So when are human beings at their best? If they feel that they're contributing to something bigger than they can do individually. If they feel that they leave this world in a better place than they found it. If they feel that collectively they're touching more people than they can do individually. And that's not different from a company, because a company ultimately is that collection of all these individuals who make up that company in the first place.
Well, Maria, on that score, let me jump over to you. Businesses should have a heart, but historically, in recent history, what seems to be the case is that businesses really are about the bottom line. However, you in Mexico, you're the head of the International Chamber of Commerce in Mexico. You run a fairly large plumbing business there. What does purpose-driven business not only mean to you, but what have you done to your business to make it purpose-driven?
Well, first of all, we cannot have a purpose in governments or in business if we do not consider half of the population of the world, and I'm talking about women. You know, today women are graduating at higher rates than men in universities, 18 to 21 in OECD countries. Also, women have better qualifications than men, the better grades when they finish school. However, before we reach 30 years old, we will be earning a lot less than men. In average, in the OECD countries, is 16% more, but when you go to countries like my country, Mexico, it's up to 40% for the same job. So if business, they need to consider this force and to bring all the potential of women if they really want to achieve their purpose in life. Also, if we took a look at the numbers that the World Bank presents, they say that some countries might benefit to 25% increase in production rates if we incorporate women at its full capacity. As a businesswoman, I had the opportunity to have my own business, so I was able to combine my family life with my business life, and I did not see why I could not share that with all the women that work for me. So it is very difficult to do that in the production line, but there are so many jobs in companies that, taking advantages of the technology that we have today, we can have both things in a certain small period of time that we need really to be there with the children when they are growing up. So what I did is I took advantage of technology, and all the people in accounting, in design, in legal departments, they could work from home when they had their children. And at a time, my company is a medium business. So when I had the opportunity to have 4 women pregnant at the same time, we lend them a small space and arrange it as a nursery for them to be close to their children. These are things that are easy, but unfortunately governments do not do it easy for companies. I got very high fine because of doing that, because that was against the law in Mexico. Mm-hmm. I would have needed to send them, the children, away to a daycare center instead of having it inside. So we need to work hand in hand, business and governments, to improve the life of millions of women and take advantage of their creativity, their innovation, and the way we look at life. For instance, in Mexico, there is a study that shows that women contribute to integrity because men feel less secure to bribe a woman instead of a man.
That's we need to study that a little bit more in Europe and the United States, perhaps. I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. So please raise your hands, and we will, I think, bring a microphone over to you. This gentleman here, is there a microphone?
Singapore has been widely acclaimed as the economic miracle in modern times. Arguably, the primary reason is that it is the only government in the world that makes money from healthcare, pensions, and public housing. What is your view of this emerging trend of nations, in a sense, behaving like corporations, particularly from the profit perspective?
It's a fascinating question. John, would you like to take that? Or yeah.
This is the emergence of nation states as actually operating public enterprises instead of corporations and businesses.
Sorry, we can't hear. John, could you speak into the microphone, please?
I think your mic's off, Pavan.
My mic is, I just muted myself, but I couldn't hear John actually, so something's going on.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me now, Pavan?
Yes, I can, yes.
The question from a friend from Singapore is talking about in Singapore the way in which the state itself is generating profit from operating healthcare and other entities. Do you see this as an emerging trend? And I can talk about it in terms of context of WTO as well. Pavan, any comments on that?
From my side, I'd just make 2 comments. One is that no surprises, because the idea that the market does provide solutions is obviously embedded in our psyche, and therefore there's no reason why government should not be resorting to markets and market mechanisms, including setting up profit-seeking units. So that's not too surprising. What I will say is that the tendency to invest in businesses other than those which provide some public service, such as healthcare, pensions, and public housing, it remains and is as widespread as a forestry company in Sweden to a energy or a steel company in India. So there has to be some resolution of this, because I think those forms of public ownerships can be both good and bad. And I think there's more to be discussed there. It's a big subject, but I think we will see at least a decade or so of that kind of mixed ownership, and possibly some solutions coming out of that mixed ownership as well. So it's not all bad. I think there's some opportunities too.
Yeah, Paul.
No, I think I would actually build on you and not abdicate too many responsibilities to governments. Governments come and go, and still the efficiencies and the way they collect and distribute their money might not also always be in the best interest of its citizens. But yet the services and the correction of the tragedies of the commons is what governments need to do. So think about healthcare. Why isn't it a normal thing that if we employ people in our businesses, that we provide healthcare for the people?
Yeah.
Why isn't it a normal thing that if people work for businesses for 30 years or 40 years, that they have a pension from those businesses? We have obligations that go beyond what seems to be now a very loose contract. We have the gig economy coming in, where it's easy to get Uber drivers on a temporary basis, or whatever other industry you want to pick on, where we really actually don't care about the human capital. That is totally unacceptable. We have a responsibility to our fellow human beings. We might be in leading positions as CEOs or as entrepreneurs, but that doesn't mean that we can abdicate our responsibilities. The second thing is in our value chains. It is, to me, mind-boggling that companies think that they can be in charge with their responsibility of only the operations under their control. When they outsource their value chain, most people think they also outsource their responsibilities. That's ridiculous. If I'm in the food business and I buy my ingredients and the result is deforestation, I'm responsible for the deforestation. If I have a CO2 emission and I cause air pollution and people die because of air pollution, then I'm part of that responsibility. So if we don't have the leaders that assume their broader responsibility for humanity to function, the world is not going to function. So to abdicate that to governments is the wrong thing. Now what governments can do is they can put these frameworks in place, these rules, laws and regulations, so that you don't get free riders. But the government alone doesn't generate wealth. The government alone is actually a bad distributor of wealth. But what the governments can certainly do is put these right frameworks in place. And what I'm arguing for is a very simple thing. And it's difficult to do, but it's a simple thing. That when governance is not quite functioning in today's world, the private sector has to step up to de-risk the political process. I believe, and that's the essence of the foundation I've created, I believe that in every business, in every industry, there's about 25 to 30% of people that really want to do the right thing. Then there's 50% that is sort of on the sideline. Let's see how it goes. And then there is about probably the rest that is defending their vested order because they live on a little island of prosperity in the sea of poverty that we've created. So you focus on those 30%, you bring these 30% together, and you create tipping points. And when you create these tipping points, you actually de-risk the political process as well. We started only 6 months ago with my new foundation called Imagine, with the fashion industry. The fashion industry is very important. We all like clothes. It's an expression of us. There's a lot of positive connotations to that. But unfortunately, if you look at the footprint on biodiversity, on oceans, on climate, and I would argue labor standards, it doesn't score so high. It's actually, after fossil fuel, the second most polluting industry. And the trend is not our friend. We now have 52 seasons and fast fashion, and everybody has 3 or 4 times more clothes at home than 3 or 4 decades ago. So we brought 30% of the industry together, total value chain, including the suppliers in your parts of the world with a lot of the sellers on this part of the world. And together we said we are going to sign up for 1.5 degrees, that is net zero by 2050, because the world can't afford more. We're going to regenerative agriculture on cotton because whole lakes are drying up. And we're going to go out of single-use plastic, which is frankly, we are soon in a situation that there's more plastic in the oceans than fish. Every fish has already a 70% chance of having plastics in it. I don't want to be part of that. These guys collectively say they don't want to be part of it. Now what happens? If you have 30% of the industry together, then a lot of companies start calling. Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you ask me? Well, we did, but you didn't respond. Or your CSR manager was on holidays or sleeping. So join us now, because otherwise you'll be obsoleted. Because soon the world will say, these are the companies I want to deal with, and these are the companies I'm going to vote out of business. And by the way, if the world wouldn't say it, I'd spend all my intellectual capital energy to be sure to point it out to the world, because I wouldn't want those companies to be around either. NGOs will start working with you, because NGOs say, instead of picking on each company and keep telling them that they're irresponsible, all of a sudden I have a group of 30%, it's like Groupon, that I can work with. I can work with to move things forward. It becomes very constructive. And then governments, as we've seen with the government of France around the G7, or that we're now seeing with the COP negotiations, the COP25 in Chile, they're saying, well, if we have those industries, let's then put the right frameworks in place. Not the short term that get me re-elected, not the knee-jerk ones that react to the symptoms, but that go really to the underlying causes and do the long-term strategic things. And what you see in France now, every second a truckload of clothes goes into the oceans or in a landfill, which is ridiculous. So we put circular economy laws in place. Yeah, there are different standards of labor, and off you go. And the industry becomes better. It gets a permission or a license to operate, and frankly, we'll have a very successful long-term future. Ultimately, the question that needs to be addressed is one of overconsumption. We cannot have an economic system where we consume more stuff, more stuff, more stuff, more stuff, when the world doesn't have it. So that needs to be addressed. But there are many ways to address that. If the industry gets together, you'll find quite some solutions of actually doing less in terms of stuff and getting more. And that's where we ultimately need to be if we want to live on this planet for generations to come.
Great. Well, let us reserve time. We've got time for actually about one more question. And by the way, Paul neglected to mention that at some point you wanted to be a priest, so we can understand where some of your sentiments are coming from. Yes, sir, this gentleman. Please pass him a microphone.
There's arise from. Sorry, one of the issues that seems to arise from measuring these various other things other than profit is how you do that measuring. And I just wondered whether we've got well-advanced measuring tools that can permit people to make these decisions, and whether you could comment on that.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Who can answer that?
Yeah, so really quickly,
quickly, and then we'll move to...
Pavan, I think, wants to make a comment. Did you hear Pavan?
Yes.
Are there ways of measuring the externalities?
1 minute on.
So what is happening is, very quickly, I'll make very short now. In about 30 or 40 years ago, the values of companies, we could explain about 80% of the value of companies with their assets that were there. Now the economy has changed to a service economy, technology, data, but also so much money has plowed in, valuations have gone up so much that we only explain 30% of the companies. So the financial market has become a casino. That's why you see share prices go up and down. There's no other answer to that. Now, but it's a matter of intellectual laziness. Because you just go to Glassdoor and you can see what the culture of a company is. It's always surprising to me that we were #1 and Kraft Heinz was on the bottom and nobody said anything. You can look at rankings on who has sustainable sourcing. You can look at human rights, how people treat people. If you don't treat people with respect, I don't have respect for the company in the first place, because it's an amalgamation of these people. And all the data is available, but it's intellectual laziness that we don't get that. So we've created a group of people with the grants from the Moore Foundation and others to redefine social and environmental capital and bring all these trendsetters, because everybody is trying, bring them together. There's now an alliance that has formed, which is pretty good, which is called the World Benchmarking Alliance, and they look at the impact that companies have actually on, for example, bringing the Sustainable Development Goals to life. And you can rank companies who count their contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals. Interestingly, when you do something, it might make some goals slightly negative and others more positive, so you need to look at an average over time, hence a long-term model. Okay. So many possibilities to find the answers if you really want. What you now see is $30 trillion in environmental, social, and governance investing. Companies like Generation and Al Gore do extremely well. For the first time, the financial market is saying, it's very good what I'm going to say, that 30% of the financial market now believes that ESG investing is more profitable. And frankly, the data are showing this.
Well, we have three other folks who want to add to that.
I'll just quickly add, because often when we talk...
John, and then Maria, and then we'll end up...
Often we talk and we imagine corporations as these very large entities capable of doing a lot of things with a lot of tools before them. But when we talk at the ICC, when I talk about the mass mobilization, I'm actually talking about micro and small medium enterprises. And what I'm saying, when we're talking about the transformation, we need to ensure that we align now these companies with this issue of individual benefit and broader value for community. We also, what we do at the ICC, we create tools because we make stuff. So what we're doing is trying to find ways to help those companies, those entities, and often, as you know, 90% of companies or something only have a profitability of about +6 or +7%. So we're not talking about mega profits here, so most of them are fighting to stay in business, and at the same time we want to help them transform to ensure that they're actually living up to this idea of creating greater value for community, because we think that's important to preserve the model that helps them operate, and we think that's a good thing to do. So we're involved in that, creating tools which could actually then mass mobilize to support this big transformation.
Maria, how do you
What I wanted
see
to say is that the best way to measure if you're doing it right is what your consumers think about your company. I mean, we tend to forget that it is consumers the ones that have the power. We, the people, we're in a democracy forum. And for companies, it's the same. If we are not involved in the concerns of the whole population right now, our products and our company are going to become obsolete because nobody is going to want it. But we don't need to forget that we, the consumers, are the ones that choose the company. I can go and buy a soap for my dishwasher from Unilever or for another company, but I'm going to choose that company that is implementing the things that I believe that need to be implemented.
That is really putting its money where its mouth is. Yeah.
Exactly.
Pavan, final word here. Hello?
There's progress on benchmarks. Pavan here. This was not possible 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, but right now, companies like my own are evolving benchmarks for environmental and human capital impacts, and it will be great to be able to provide those to the MSMEs, because all the MSMEs are looking to be part of bigger value chains, and that's only normal. They're not able to, at this point, able to prove whether they're good, bad, or indifferent, and where they fall in the histogram of impacts, be it social or be it environmental. But this is soon possible. So I think technology is really helping in moving this along at a very rapid pace.
Great. Well, I would invite anybody who has additional questions to come up and speak with the panelists afterwards. We need to keep the trains running on time because we have an address by the President in just a few minutes. But before we close, I'd like to invite my colleague Stephen Dunbar-Johnson of the New York Times up.
Thank you. I don't have a microphone, but I'm trying to project. I'd just like to thank John and the ICC for stimulating this conversation. It's a conversation that really does need to happen. I remember, I think it was about 20 years ago, reading a book by British journalist Will Hutton about how shareholder value, we were slaves to shareholder value, and that we needed to unshackle ourselves from it. And that was some 20 years ago, and we're now having this conversation today. And I think it's a conversation that is incredibly prescient today and will grow in resonance. And Paul, I've been watching you talk about these issues now for quite some time as CEO of Unilever and as the head of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I hadn't realized that you had once had a vocation to be a priest. But now you are the high priest of business for purpose. And you have a lot of disciples, and I hope that following will grow, because it needs to grow. As we all as consumers need to be thinking about how we're restoring. We can't continue consuming in the way that we have been. We need to be thinking about restoration. And the power of women in business is absolutely crucial. It's part of the solution. So all that to say, thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you all for helping provoke the conversation. Thank you.